Welcome back. We're going to take a look in this series of lessons and in the next series as well at the War Between the States, or the Civil War, or the War of the Rebellion, or the War of Northern Aggression, depending on which view you actually take on it. Of course, I do generally take that kind of middle-of-the-road path, which is War Between the States, because that's essentially what it was. But for a title for this lesson, for this week, we're going to call this the Second War of Independence, which is very much a Southern view. We're going to continue to unpack the Southern view of the war, especially some of those Southern leaders. Because here really is kind of the problem that we come across when we deal with the War Between the States, or the Civil War, and that is if this war was indeed fought for slavery, if this was ultimately an anti-slavery war, since the Union won, since the Emancipation Proclamation freed the slaves, at least in enemy territory, but was later followed by the amendment to end slavery for all time. If it indeed was that, then we really have this problem when we look at the South, because we really have to see the South as villainous. We have to see the South as a group of people who were all about defending slavery, which was morally reprehensible. But of course, we've already unpacked this whole issue of slavery, which is a sin issue for the South, but we've already seen is that slavery existed also in the North. We've already seen that several states in the North had laws prohibiting Africans from even settling within their boundaries, particularly in the area of the Midwest. We've also already seen how the Emancipation Proclamation didn't actually free any slaves, even though Abraham Lincoln had the opportunity to do so in places such as Missouri or Kentucky or the parts of Tennessee or even Virginia that were under Union control. He chose not to. And so really we have this whole issue of slavery not necessarily being the primary cause, but then we have yet another layer, and that is the fact when you look at the South, you actually come across several noble and honorable figures in its history. You'll find this in the North as well. You find principled men, you find believers, you find honorable people on both sides of this struggle. But when you look at the leadership of the North, you really do find a bit of a different picture than, say, the leadership of the South. And I hope to unpack that for you in these coming lessons. So we're really asking the basic question, what is the cause of the actual Civil War? And we've already unpacked it in many ways and looked at it in many different lights in previous lessons on those house-divided topics. But once again, let me read to you this quote by John C. Calhoun. After all, it was the senator from South Carolina who really, in his very last speech, up to nearly his dying breath, really referred people back to the principles of the Constitution, which was that whole idea of federalism, that the states were freely united together, and that if one state disagreed with the practice of another, it could appeal to it in terms of brotherhood, but it did not actually have the authority to make another state do something. If it had that authority, then it would actually take away the very brotherhood basis it was built on. In the same way that if your parents put one of your siblings in charge of you and your other brothers and sisters, then it would actually create havoc on the nature of your home and upon your family. But let's take a look at this quote by John C. Calhoun, which I have read to you before, but it's worth hearing again. He said this: "Stripped of all its covering, the naked question is, leading up to the war between the states, whether ours is a federal or a consolidated government, a constitutional or absolute one, a government resting solidly on the basis of the sovereignty of the states, or on the unrestrained will of a majority, a form of government, as in all other unlimited ones, in which injustice, violence, and force must ultimately prevail." So according to Calhoun, the real division, the real debate, the real primary issue you could even say, was between that whole idea of federalism, where you actually have very distinct responsibilities and very distinct limitations on authority. The authority of the federal government and the authority of states, still preserving the authority of people. versus the whole idea of what we call nationalism or statism. Where is that initial idea that the state is the greatest good? They're the greatest agent for grace and mercy and justice and humility in this world, and so therefore they need to be supported and propped up in whatever ways possible. This was something the Founding Fathers really fought fiercely against, which is why in the Bill of Rights they laid out this 10th Amendment. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. That's what the war between the states was actually fought over. Whether or not the states preserved all the rights along with the people that the federal government did not specifically have in the Constitution. That was the whole purpose of the Bill of Rights. In fact, let's just read what the Founding Fathers said the purpose of the Bill of Rights was. The conventions of a number of the states, having at the time of their adopting the Constitution expressed a desire, in order to prevent misconstruction or abuse of its powers, that's referring to the abuse of federal powers, that further declaratory and restrictive clauses should be added, and as extending the ground of public confidence in the government will best ensure the beneficent ends of its institution. In other words, the Constitution, for it to work, had to have very clear set limits, and the Bill of Rights was meant to further define those limits. Now here's the issue, though, we ultimately always come back to in the war between the states, and that is you still do have that moral issue of slavery being tossed back and forth between the North and the South. And as a result of this, the North was aggressively able to say that they were the virtuous ones because in many ways they were against slavery, particularly from those abolitionists who were sometimes admired by Northerners and sometimes not admired. But even so, they generally had a view against slavery. But perhaps more importantly, the North always believed that the federal government was the greatest of authorities, and so therefore they were loyal to that authority. As a result, as Robert Penn Warren has noted, when the North actually won this conflict for the Union, it was able to have what he notes as the treasury of virtue. In other words, it was able to say that because they had won, it essentially justified whatever they did, because ultimately they did end slavery. Ultimately, they did keep the Union together, and therefore, even if there was this terrific war, even if there was all of these horrific things that occurred leading up to these wonderful things, you just have to kind of ignore those. In other words, it was the right thing done, but in the wrong way. Whereas the South really became aggressively defensive during this time. The South, instead of really evaluating slavery as being a moral wrong and really seeking out ways to actually end it, chose instead to really rally behind slavery in many ways and make that a central platform. But of course, as we're going to see, not every Southerner fought for that reason. In fact, I would argue very few Southerners fought for that reason. They really were fighting for their home. They really were fighting for what they saw as just authority of the states and the people to govern themselves. But Robert Penn Warren also points out that because the Southern states lost the war, they gained what he calls the great alibi. In other words, they could always see themselves as a victim. They could always see themselves as having lost, and therefore, it doesn't really matter if we pursue righteousness anymore. That's of course not true for everyone, but it is one of the primary problems and why this conflict is so pivotal in our history and so in need of redemption. Either way, though, we're going to unpack this story, and we're going to see that it takes two to fight. We're going to see that we can't entirely point the finger at either the North or the South, because both sides contributed, whether it was being self-righteous or whether it was being seen as a victim. It does indeed take two to fight, but we'll look at that in the coming video.